Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Nikki, Rebecca, Kiwi, Michael, and Robin. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. Your help makes it possible to produce new episodes week after week and keep them ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. Since you supported us in the month of May, all of you, along with everyone who supported us in April, will be entered into a drawing at the end of the month, the prize for which is an exclusive episode made just for you. And because it's just for you, we'll be a little lenient with those copyright restrictions. If you'd like to support us and be entered into that drawing, you'll find links to Patreon as well as buymeacoffee.com in the show description, and I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's relax and read. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're continuing with one of the most popular books I've read on this podcast, The History of Bread, From Prehistoric to Modern Times, by John Ashton, published in 1904 by the Religious Tract Society, London. Let's pick up where we left off. Chapter 4. The Bread of the Classic Lands. As an introduction to the bread of the Romans and Greeks, let us begin with the pretty myth of Demeter, or Ceres as the Romans called her, and her daughter Persephone. Zeus, or Jupiter, had promised his daughter Persephone to Pluto without informing Demeter of his plan. And whilst the girl was plucking flowers, which Zeus had caused to grow in order to fix her attention, Pluto seized her, and the earth opening, they disappeared, and went to his kingdom of Hades. Many places have been assigned as the spot where this took place, but the ancient Eleusis, not far from Salamis or Athens, now the little village of Lefsina, has, if such a thing were possible, perhaps the prior claim. For here stood the famous temple of Demeter, now lately excavated and surveyed, and here were performed the Eleusinian mysteries in her honor. The shrieks of Persephone were heard only by Hecate and Helios, and her mother, hearing only the echo of her voice, at once darted down to earth in search of her beloved child. Hopelessly and aimlessly she wandered about, caring nothing for herself, and for 9 whole days and nights neither ate nor drank, tasted neither nectar nor ambrosia, nor did she even bathe herself. On the 10th day she met Hecate, who told her all she knew of her daughter's disappearance, which was not much, as she had heard but her piercing cries. But thinking that Helios, the all-seeing sun, might have viewed the scene, they hastened to him, and he told them how it all happened, how Pluto had carried off her daughter with the approval and consent of Zeus. Heartbroken at this conduct of the father of her child, she would have no more of the society of the gods, and forswore Olympus, preferring to live rather among men on earth. And so she dwelt among them, rewarding those who were kind to her, and severely punishing those who did not treat her well. And in this way, still wandering and mourning for her lost child, she came to Eleusis, where Celeus was king. But her wrath was still as fierce as ever, and by withholding her gifts, the fields produced no crops, and there was famine upon earth. And so sore indeed did it become, that Zeus, perceiving it, feared that the race of man might become extinct for lack of food, and sent Iris as ambassador to try and persuade Demeter to return to Olympus. But she was firm, although all the gods were sent to her to induce her to relent, and nothing would she do to mitigate the evil she had wrought, save on the condition that her daughter should be restored to her. Hermes was sent to Pluto, and his mission met with partial success. Persephone had eaten of the pomegranate seed, which sacredly pledged her to her dread lord, and for 3 months in the year she must leave her mother and the fair earth and go to live in Pluto's dreary kingdom. Hermes fulfilled his mission by restoring her to her loving mother, who rejoiced over her with an exceeding joy. Zeus, choosing this happy moment, sent Rhea to Demeter to conciliate her and prevail upon her to return to Olympus, a task which she happily effected. The earth smiled once more and became fertile, and Demeter, with her daughter, to whom she was lent for 9 months in the year, went to dwell once more in the companionship of the gods. But before she left the earth, she rewarded Celeus, the king of Eleusis, who had been kind to her, by giving his son Triptolemus a chariot with winged dragons and seeds of wheat. His chariot was useful, for by means of it he was able to ride all over the earth and instruct men in growing corn. He established the worship of Demeter at Eleusis and instituted the mysteries in honor of the goddess. And in this pretty myth of Demeter and Persephone, we may trace the story of the seasons, how for 9 months the earth is smiling and fertile, and for the remaining 3 is dead. Dr. Schliemann claimed to have found the site of ancient Troy when he uncovered the hill of Hisarlik. It was undoubtedly the remains of a prehistoric city, and one which had advanced to a considerable amount of civilization, and this is shown particularly in one instance, in the huge earthenware jars, or pithoi, that were used for storing corn and wine. The following illustration gives a graphic description of them as they appeared in situ. One of the compartments of the uppermost houses below the temple of Athena, and belonging to the third, the burnt city, appears to have been used as a magazine for storing corn or wine, for there are in it 9 enormous earthenware jars of various forms, about 5 feet high and 4 3/4 feet across, their mouths being from 29 1/2 inches to 35 1/4 inches broad. Each of them has 4 handles, 3 3/4 inches broad, and the clay of which they are made is as much as 2 1/4 inches thick. Dr. Schliemann says, "The number of large jars which I brought to light in the burnt stratum of the third city certainly exceeds 600. By far the larger number of them were empty, the mouth being covered by a large flag of schist or limestone. This leads me to the conclusion that the jars were filled with wine or water at the time of the catastrophe, for there appears to have been hardly any reason for covering them if they had been empty. Had they been used to contain anything else but liquids, I should have found traces of the fact, but only in a very few cases did I find some carbonized grain in the jars, and only twice a small quantity of a white mass, the nature of which I could not determine. So that we see that this prehistoric nation not only grew corn, but stored it for future use. The means this prehistoric people had of crushing or mealing the grain was the same as usual. The saddle querns, or 2 stones with flat surfaces, between which the grain was crushed and roughly triturated, so frequently found on the continent, and the pestle and mortar of the lake dwellings, as also round stones for fitting into hollows, such as are found in the lakes, the cave dwellings of the Dordogne, and in the dolmens of France. Dr. Schliemann, in describing the Trojan saddle querns, says they are either of trachyte or of basaltic lava, but by far the larger number are of the former material. They are of oval form, flat on one side and convex on the other, and resemble an egg cut longitudinally through the middle. Their length is from 7 inches to 14 inches, and even as much as 25 inches. The very long ones are generally crooked longitudinally. Their breadth is from 5 inches to 14 inches. The grain was bruised between the flat sides of 2 of these querns, but only a kind of groats can have been produced in this way, not flour. The bruised grain could not have been used for making bread. In Homer we find it used for porridge, and also for strewing on the roasted meat. In Homeric times the corn was evidently ground by millstones, which were probably precisely similar to those found by Dr. Schliemann, as we see in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Pliny, in his Natural History, speaking of millstones, says, "In no country are the molar stones superior to those of Italy. Stones, be it remembered, not fragments of rock. There are some provinces, too, where they are not to be found at all. Some stones of this class are softer than others, and admit of being smoothed with the whetstone, so as to present all the appearance at a distance of serpentine. There is no more durable stone than this, for in general, stone, like wood, suffers from the action, more or less, of rain, heat, and cold. Some persons give this molar stone the name of pyrites, from the circumstance that it has a great affinity to fire." In Book 28, Pliny gives us the mode of grinding corn. All the grains are not easily broken. In Etruria, they first parch the spelt in the ear, and then pound it with a pestle shod with iron at the end. In this instrument, the iron is notched at the bottom, sharp ridges running out like the edge of a knife and concentrating in the form of a star, so that, if care is not taken to hold the pestle perpendicularly while pounding, the grains will only be splintered and the iron teeth broken. Throughout the greater part of Italy, however, they employ a pestle that is only rough at the end, and wheels turned by water by means of which the corn is gradually ground. I shall here set forth the opinions given by Mago as to the best method of pounding corn. He says that the wheat should be steeped first of all in water, and then cleaned from the husk, after which it should be dried in the sun and then pounded with the pestle. The same plan, he says, should be adopted in the preparation of barley. This was how corn was prepared in some parts of Italy at the time of the Christian era, by the same method as that described here by Livingstone. The corn is pounded in a large wooden mortar, like the ancient Egyptian one, with a pestle 6 feet long and about 4 inches thick. The pounding is performed by 2 or even 3 women at one mortar. Each, before delivering a blow with her pestle, gives an upward jerk of the body so as to put strength into the stroke, and they keep exact time so that 2 pestles are never in the mortar at the same moment. By the operation of pounding, with the aid of a little water, the hard outside scale or husk of the grain is removed, and the corn is made fit for the millstone. The meal irritates the stomach unless cleared from the husk. Without considerable energy in the operation, the husk sticks fast to the corn. Solomon thought that still more vigor than is required to separate the hard husk or bran from the wheat would fail to separate a fool from his folly. Though thou shouldst bray a fool in a mortar among wheat with a pestle, yet will not his foolishness depart from him. We have noticed the primitive Homeric millstones and the Etruscan pestles and mortars, but at the time of the Christian era, things molinary were somewhat more advanced. Doubtless in parts of the country, the hand mill or quern, called mola manuaria, versatilis or trusatilis, was in use, and it was worked by slaves who were sent to the Pistorinium as a punishment. But the usual corn mill was worked by animals, and was called mola iumentaria or mola asinaria. Both Greeks and Romans originally ground their flour and baked their bread at home, and mills and bakeries have been found in several private houses in Pompeii. One of these bakeries was attached to the house of Sallust on the south side, being divided from it only by a narrow street. Its front is the main street or Via Consularis, leading from the gate of Herculaneum to the Forum. Entering by a small vestibule, the visitor finds himself in a portico of ample dimensions, being about 36 feet by 30 feet. At the end of the portico is an opening through which the bakehouse is entered, which is at the back of the house, and opens into a smaller street, which, diverging from the main street at the fountain by Panza's house, runs straight up to the city walls. The workroom of the mill and bakery is about 33 feet long by 26 feet. The center is occupied by 4 stone mills, and when it was uncovered, the ironwork, though entirely rust-eaten, was yet perfect enough to explain satisfactorily the method of construction. Not only were the flour mills, kneading troughs, and other utensils for baking bread in Pompeii, but there were also loaves of bread of round form and subdivided, some of which were stamped with the baker's name. That this was the usual form of loaf is also shown by a painting on the walls of the Temple of Augustus, where we see the bread partially broken, and by the representation of a baker's shop, where all the loaves are similarly shaped. This, at all events, seems to have been the shape in vogue about the time of the Christian era. But in the bas-relief on the tomb of Eurysaces, who was a baker in a large way of business at Rome, they seem to be globular. These bas-reliefs are most interesting, as they show the whole history of baking. First, there is the purchase of the corn, and payment being made for it. Then we see it ground and sifted to separate the bran. Next, a man is buying some flour. Then we see the dough being kneaded by horsepower, the baker with his peel baking the loaves, which are afterwards carried in panniers to be weighed. Then there are the customers, and the bread being sent out for delivery. Pliny tells us that there were no bakers at Rome until the war with King Perseus of Macedon, more than 580 years after the building of the city. The ancient Romans used to make their own bread, it being an occupation which belonged to the women, as we see is the case in many nations even at the present day. In those times they had no cooks in the number of their slaves, but used to hire them for the occasion from the market. The Gauls were the first to employ the bolter that is made of horsehair, while the people of Spain made their sieves and meal dressers of flax, and the Egyptians of papyrus and rushes. Many freedmen were engaged as bakers, and under the Republic it was one of the duties of the odiles to see that the bread was properly prepared and correct in weight. Grain was delivered into public granaries by enrolled Sacari, and it was distributed to the bakers by a corporation called the Catabalenses. A bakers' guild, corpus or collegium pistorum, which long existed, was organized by Trajan, and this body, through its connection with the Cura Ammone, became of much importance and enjoyed various privileges. There were guilds of pistores and clibonari at Pompeii. A great increase in the number of bakeries, pistrini, officini, and pistoriae, afterwards took place at Rome, owing probably to the action of Aurelian in introducing a daily distribution of bread instead of the old monthly distribution of grain that had been usual since the time of Gracchi. Chapter 5. Bread in Eastern Lands. Agriculture has always taken a prominent part in Chinese polity and is incorporated in their religious observances, and a deep veneration for it is inscribed on all the institutions in China. Among the several grades of society, the cultivators of mind rank first, then those of land. Third come the manufacturers, and lastly the merchants. Homage to agriculture is done annually by the emperor, who makes a show of performing its operations. This ceremony, which originated more than 2,000 years ago, had been discontinued by degenerate princes, but was revived by Yang Qing, the third of the Manchu dynasty. This anniversary takes place on the 24th day of the second moon, coinciding with our month of February. The monarch prepares himself for it by fasting 3 days. He then repairs to the appointed spot with 3 princes, 9 presidents of the high tribunals, 40 old and 40 young husbandmen. Having performed a preliminary sacrifice of the fruits of the earth to Shang-Ti, the supreme deity, he takes in his hand the plow and makes a furrow of some length, in which he is followed by the princes and other grandees. A similar course is observed in sowing the field, and the operations are completed by the husbandmen. An annual festival in honor of agriculture is also celebrated in the capital of each province. The governor marches forth crowned with flowers and accompanied by a numerous train bearing flags adorned with agricultural emblems and portraits of eminent husbandmen, while the streets are decorated with lanterns and triumphal arches. Although rice is the staple grain in use in China, wheat growing is one of the principal industries in the northern and middle parts of that country. The winter wheat is planted at about the same time that wheat is planted here. The soil, especially in the northern provinces, is so well worn that it is unfitted for wheat growing, and the Chinese farmers, appreciating this fact, and the fact that all kinds of fertilizers are excessively dear, make the least money do the most good by mixing the seed with finely prepared manure. A man with a basket swung upon his shoulders follows the plow and plants the mixture in large handsful in the furrows, so that when the crop grows up, it looks like young celery. Immediately after the first melting of snow, and when the ground has become sufficiently hardened by frost, these wheat fields are turned into pastures, under the theory that, by a timely clipping of the tops of these plants, the crops will grow up with additional strength in the spring. Wheat threshing is the principal interest in Chinese farming. Owing to the scarcity of fuel, the wheat is usually pulled up by the root, bundled in sheaves, and carted to the mianchong, a smooth and hardened space of ground near the home of the farmer. The top of the sheaves is then clipped off by a hand machine. The wheat is then left in the mianchong to dry, whilst the headless sheaves are piled in a heap for fuel or thatching. When the wheat is thoroughly dry, it is beaten under a great stone roller pulled by horses, while the places thus rolled are constantly tossed over with pitchforks. The stalks left untouched by the roller are threshed with flails by women and boys. The beaten stalks and straws are then taken out by an ingenious arrangement of pitchforks, and the chaff is removed by a systematic tossing of the grain into the air until the wind blows every particle of chaff or dust out of the wheat. Even the chaff is carefully swept up and stowed away for fuel or other useful purposes, such as stuffing mattresses or pillows. After the wheat is allowed to dry for a few hours in the burning sun, it is stowed away in airy bamboo bins. The milling process is a very ancient one. 2 large round blue stone wheels with grooves neatly cut in the faces on one side, and in the center of the lower wheel a solid wooden plug is used. The process of making flour out of wheat by this machinery is called mab mien. Usually a horse or mule is employed. The poor, having no animals, grind the grain themselves. 3 distinct qualities of flour are thus produced. The shanmien, or A grade, is the first siftings. The ni-mien, or second grade, is the grindings of the rough leavings from the first siftings, which is of a darker and redder color than the first grade. And mod is the finely ground last siftings of all grades. When bread is made from this grade, it resembles rough gingerbread. This is usually the food of the poorest families. The bread of the Chinese is usually fermented and then steamed. Only a very small quantity is baked in ovens. But the staple articles of food in northern China are wheat, millet, and sweet potatoes. Wheat and rice are the food of the rich, while the middle classes of the empire eat millet and rice. In the southern provinces, the entire breadstuff is rice. At Qingqiang, wheat is served as rice. It is first threshed with flails made of bamboo, and then pounded by a rough stone hammer, working in a mortar which rests on a pivot, and is operated like a treadle by the human foot. This separates the husks, and it is then winnowed, the grain being afterwards ground in the usual way. Rice is undoubtedly the staple food of those parts of China where it will grow, in spite of its being a precarious crop, the failure of which means famine. A drought in its early stages withers it, and an inundation when nearly ripe is equally destructive, whilst the birds and locusts, which are fearfully numerous in China, infest it more than any other grain. Rice requires not only intense heat, but moisture so abundant that the field in which it grows must be repeatedly laid under water. These requisites exist only in the districts south of the Yangtze-Kiang, or the Yellow River, and its several tributaries. Here a vast extent of land is perfectly fitted for this valuable crop. Confined by powerful dikes, these rivers do not generally, like the Nile, overflow and cover the country, but by means of canals, their waters are so widely distributed that almost every farmer, when he pleases, can inundate his field. This supplies not only moisture, but a fertilizing mud or slime washed down from the distant mountains. The cultivator thus dispenses with manure, of which he labors under a great scarcity, and considers it enough if the grain be steeped in liquid manure. The Chinese always transplant their rice. A small space is enclosed and very thickly sown, after which a thin sheet of water is led or pumped over it. In the course of a few days the shoots appear, and when they have attained the height of 6 or 7 inches, the tops are cut off, and the roots transplanted to a field prepared for the purpose, where they are set in rows about 6 inches from each other. The whole surface is again supplied with moisture, which continues to cover the plants till they approach maturity, when the ground is allowed to become dry. The first harvest is reaped in the end of May or beginning of June, the grain being cut with a small sickle and carried off the field in frames suspended from bamboo poles, placed across a man's shoulders. Barrow thus describes one. The machine usually employed for clearing rice from the husk in the large way is exactly the same as that now used in Egypt for the same purpose, only that the latter is put in motion by oxen and the former commonly by water. This machine consists of a long horizontal axis of wood, with cogs or projecting pieces of wood or iron fixed upon it at certain intervals, and it is turned by a water wheel. At right angles to this axis are fixed as many horizontal levers as there are circular rows of cogs. These levers act on pivots that are fastened into a low brick wall, but parallel to the axis and at a distance of about 2 feet from it. At the further extremity of each lever and perpendicular to it is fixed a hollow pestle directly over a large mortar of stone or iron sunk into the ground. The other extremity extending beyond the wall, being pressed upon by the cogs of the axis in its rotation, elevates the pestle, which by its own gravity falls into the mortar. An axis of this kind sometimes gives motion to 15 or 20 levers. Meantime, the stubble is burnt on the land, over which the ashes are spread as its only manure. A second crop is immediately sown and reaped about the end of October, when the straw is left to putrefy on the ground, which is allowed to rest till the commencement of the ensuing spring. As the cereal food of the Chinese is principally boiled rice, it stands to reason that bakers are not numerous, bread only appearing at the tables of high-class mandarins. It is chiefly replaced by fancy biscuits and numberless kinds of pastry, made not only with wheaten flour but also that of rice. These serve as vehicles for the various jams and fruit compotes for which the Chinese are famous, and which they know so well how to make. In fact, the bakers are more strictly confectioners, and they can be seen any day busy in their shops, baking cakes of rice flour and ground almonds of every imaginable shape and varied in quality by spices. Not only so, but these cakes are sold already baked in the peripatetic cookeries which go about the streets. Out of wheaten flour they make a kind of vermicelli, which is much esteemed by the Chinese. Failure of the rice crops and consequent famine in Japan have been the means of introducing wheaten flour into this country more rapidly than anything else could have done. Most remarkable is the universal favor that bread and similar floury concoctions are beginning to enjoy in the treaty ports. This article of food has become completely Japanized and sells in forms unknown to Europeans. Suke pao, sold by peripatetic vendors, is much liked by the poorer classes. It consists of slices, thick, generous slices, of bread dipped in soy and brown sugar, and then fried or toasted. Each slice has a skewer passed through it, which the buyer returns after demolishing the bread. Flour is now used in many other ways besides the manufacture of simple bread. There is kashpao, cake bread, which is sold everywhere, As the name implies, it is a sort of sweet breadstuff made into cakes of various sizes and artistic figures, according to the skill and fancy of the baker. To a European palate, this kashpao is rather dry and tasteless, but it is very cheap, and for 5 sen, or 3 halfpence, a huge paper bagful can be bought. Kasutira, or sponge cake, is not so much sought after as it used to be. Yet some bakeries, such as the Fugetsudo and Tsuboya, excel in producing the lightest and most delicious sponge cake. Wheat is not the primary article of food among the natives of India, and hitherto only enough has been produced for home consumption. But of late years much has been grown for export, and being of a particularly hard nature, is useful for mixing with the softer kinds. Still, it is used by itself, and is made into unleavened cakes called chapati. These are made by mixing flour and water together with a little salt into a paste or dough, kneading it well. Sometimes ghee or clarified butter is added. They may also be made with milk instead of water. They are flattened into thin cakes with the hand, smeared with a small quantity of ghee, and baked on an iron pan or sheet of iron over the fire. Historic, too, is the chapati, for by its means the message was sent round throughout the length and breadth of British India for the rising against the English rule, known as the Indian Mutiny. Its true meaning was not at first understood, as we may read in the Indian correspondence of the Times, dated Bombay, March 3rd, 1857. From Cawnpore to Allahabad, and onwards towards the great cities of the northwest, the chowkidars or policemen have been of late spreading from village to village, at whose command or for what object they themselves, it is said, are ignorant, little plain cakes of wheaten flour. The number of cakes and the mode of their transmission is uniform. Chowkidar of village A enters village B, and addressing its chowkidar, commits to his charge 2 cakes, with directions to have other 2 similar to them prepared, and leaving the old in his own village, to hie with the new to village C, and so on. English authorities of the districts through which these edibles passed looked at, handled, and probably tasted them, and finding them upon the evidence of all their senses harmless, reported accordingly to the government. And it appears, I think, with tolerable clearness, that the mysterious mission is not of political but of superstitious origin, and is directed simply to the warding off of diseases, such as the choleriac visitation of 12 months ago, in which point of view it is noteworthy and characteristic, and not unworthy to be remembered, together with last year's grim and picturesque legend of the horseman who rode down to the river at dead of night and was ferried across, announcing that the pestilence was in his train. Apropos of Indian flour, Colonel Meadows Taylor, in The Story of My Life, tells a story about the adulteration of flour in India. Quote, "During that day my tent was beset by hundreds of pilgrims and travelers, crying loudly for justice against the flour sellers, who not only gave short weight in flour, but adulterated it so distressingly with sand that the cakes made with it were uneatable and had to be thrown away. That evening I told some reliable men of my escort to go quietly into the bazaars and each buy flour at a separate shop, being careful to note whose shop it was. The flour was brought to me. I tested every sample and found it full of sand as I passed it under my teeth. I then desired that all the persons named in my list should be sent to me with their baskets of flour, their weights and scales. Shortly afterwards they arrived, evidently suspecting nothing, and were placed in a row, seated on the grass before my tent. "Now," said I gravely, "each of you is to weigh out a ser, or 2 pounds of your flour," which was done. "Is it for the pilgrims?" asked one. "No," I said quietly, though I had much difficulty to keep my countenance. "You must eat it yourselves." They saw that I was in earnest and offered to pay any fine that I imposed. "Not so," I returned. "You have made many eat your flour. Why should you object to eat it yourselves?" They were horribly frightened, and amid the jeers and screams of laughter of the bystanders, some of them actually began to eat, spluttering out the half-moistened flour which could be heard crunching between their teeth. At last some of them flung themselves on their faces, abjectly beseeching pardon. "Swear," I cried, "swear by the Holy Mother in yonder temple that you will not fill the mouths of her worshippers with dirt. You have brought this on yourselves, and there is not a man in all the country who will not laugh at the flour sellers who could not eat their own flour because it broke their teeth." So this episode terminated, and I heard no more complaints of bad flour. End quote. The Indian flour mill is very primitive, consisting of 2 great millstones, of which the lower is fast, and the upper is usually turned by 2 women, who feed the wheat by handfuls into a hole which passes through the stone. The meal so obtained is simply mixed with palm yeast, and baked in very hot ovens which have been heated for several days. The small European householder finds it more convenient to patronize the Mohammedan bakers, of whom, however, the bread has to be ordered in advance. Sometimes 2 or 3 English families combine and hire a baker, paying him a monthly salary and providing him with the raw material. The yeast mentioned above is made from the sap of the date palm. In April, before the flowers appear, a man climbs the naked trunk, for the leaves, as in all palm trees, are borne on the top. The man's feet are bound together by a rope, and about his hips are fastened 2 pots for the reception of the sap. As he climbs, he calls out, "Darpur, Darpur Atahan," which being interpreted means, "The palm tapper is coming." This is for the benefit of the Mohammedan women, who might be sitting unveiled in the courtyards of the houses, exposed to the view of the climber after he has risen above the tops of the walls. A tapper who once fails to give this warning cry is thenceforth forbidden to ply his trade. When the tapper has reached the crown of the tree, he cuts 2 gashes in opposite sides of the trunk with an axe, which he has carried up in his mouth. Then he fastens the pots under the gashes and descends, The full pots are taken away and empty ones put in their place twice daily. The sap has a sweet taste and contains some alcohol even when fresh. After standing in the sun in great earthen pots for a few days, it begins to ferment, after which it deposits a thick white substance. This, taken at the proper time, is used as yeast. But rice is in India the staff of life, being used to a greater extent than any grain in Europe. It is in fact the food of the highest and the lowest, the principal harvest of every climate. Its production, generally speaking, is only limited by the means of irrigation, which is essential to its growth. The ground is prepared in March and April. The seed is sown in May and reaped in August. If circumstances are favorable, there are other harvests, one between July and November, another between January and April. These also sometimes consist of rice, but more commonly of other grain or pulse. In some parts, millet is used as food. Many are the ways of cooking rice. There are powder of cucumber seeds and rice, lime juice and rice, orange juice and rice, jackfruit and rice and milk, and sweet cakes made of rice flour, with or without green ginger. The Bombay baker is a man of a different stamp altogether to a Bengal baker. He is invariably a Goanese and a native Christian, and adopts his profession not from choice but by heredity. For generations past, his fathers have been bakers, and have, in accordance with the rules of the Society of Bakers, to which they must have belonged, studied some portion at least of the art of manufacturing bread. The Bombay baker is, moreover, a man of substance. To begin with, he grows his own wheat, and has it conveyed to his factories, where as many as 200 hands are employed in converting it into raw material for cooking. He retains a staff of chefs who also hail from Goa, and who attend exclusively to the baking. But whether Bombay or Bengal, the same fault has to be found with the manufacturer. Either the bread is too fine, or it is too brown. That is, it contains too much bran. And with that convenient end to the chapter, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the history of bread from prehistoric to modern times. As a baker myself, I do find this interesting, and I hope you're enjoying it as well. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or send me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. I always love hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.